Hello and welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Ksenia Jmutin, I'm the director of the IAS, and today is the third day of the Festival of Failure. I think we've managed not to fail so far. So far, so good. And over the last 2 days, we've been talking about failure in politics, policy, art, engineering, you name it. And we continue the conversation today with discussion around failure in sport. And to open the discussion and the presentation, we have invited our Pro Vice-Chancellor for Sport, Professor Jo Maher, to reflect on her experiences, thoughts on failure. Over to you, Jo.
I'm delighted that Ksenia thought, what I'll do is for Jo's first appearance at IAS to talk about failure. Brilliant. So failure in sport, has there ever been a more appropriate topic? There is not an athlete on the planet that has never failed at sport. Now, the definition of how they failed at sport and how they interpret that definition and how that has impacted on them is different from athlete to athlete, coach to coach. So when we're considering failure in sport, we need to start out with, from a psychosocial perspective, what is that interpretation? So what's really great is the physiologists are going to give you some really detailed science stuff, and I'm going to give you some kind of overview of that psychological, personal interpretation and definition of failure. So the frequency by which an athlete fails is different athlete to athlete. So let's take athlete A. You sit down with any 10-year-old young athlete and say, what's your definition of success? Most of them will say something like, I want to win the league. I want to win the trophy. I want to be the top goal scorer. Believe it or not, you can sit with a pre-Olympic, pre-podium potential athlete, and they will still talk to you at the age of 18, 19, 20 in terms of, well, I need to get to the Olympics. Well, I need to win an Olympic medal. So there's an output interpretation of success. Ergo, anything short of that, they define as failure. Athlete B. Failure to them is not scoring a goal, not delivering a touchdown pass, not getting a match-winning point in tennis. So they have a performance interpretation of failure. So we start with an output interpretation, then we go down to a performance interpretation. Then when you get to athlete C, they might have a process interpretation. So a process interpretation would be a missed pass, would be when I executed that throw, my elbow wasn't where I thought it should be. So when we've worked with elite world-class swimmers, we had a world champion swimmer in the pool going back 15 years ago, who was part of a study on the psychology of the motivational climate of success. He won a world championships and was annoyed that the distance when he touched the wall between him and the athlete in second wasn't as far as he thought it should be. So he reflected his interpretation of he'd won the gold, he's annoyed at his performance, and he was able, because when we think about failure, it's not binary, it's on a continuum. So when we're thinking about that kind of transitional nature of it, he was able to reflect post-race on, I'm annoyed in performance terms because the gap between first and second was too big. But equally, I didn't feel smooth through the water. So he had the ability to reflect on how it felt, the kinesthetic feel of movement through the water, and he was annoyed at his own technical skill element. He also had an ego orientation of, I wanted that gap to be bigger because I feel that I'm this much better than that other athlete, yet still won a gold medal. So even when an athlete secures gold, they can still be annoyed at their own performance and how they feel. There is not an athlete on the planet that's ever been substituted in a match scenario and had that feel in the pit of their gut when they know if they've played well or not. They don't need the hairdryer in the dressing room. They don't need someone having a go. They know. So your personal definition of success and failure is important to your own experience of social facilitation anxiety and stress and arousal and how all those things that come with being in sport and being competitive feel. Now, just to illuminate that further, to try and give you a real kind of simple example. So my cousin Tony's 6'7". Tony's a terrible golfer, but loves it. He plays 3 times a year on corporate days out at golf. Tony's definition of success in golf, because he's 6'7", is in a whole round of 18 holes, so the non-golfers in the room, it's roughly 72 shots, could be 74. The average social golfer will be pretty happy with anything sub 100, anything over 100, you've had a pretty bad day at golf. Tony could go around in 120. He would not care. Not bothered, thinks it's funny. Tony will only define success at golf if on one of the holes he manages to absolutely nail one and it lands on the green. And then all he'll talk about in the pub to mind his mates with that one shot that got on the greens wasn't that great. Okay? Completely will not experience stress. There is not an ounce of anxiety, but he'll have a lovely day if he manages to get one away in 110 shots, he's happy with one. Max Verstappen at Red Bull is known for going on the radio to tell his pit engineer that his car that's driving at 200 miles an hour feels slow and sluggish and he's bored. He got bored at the Monaco Grand Prix, said he wanted to make a cup of tea while he was driving at 200 miles an hour. He was 0.4 of a second off the pace that he thought he should be on. World-class elite athletes and their interpretation of success and failure and the difference individually between how we interpret that makes a complete difference into how we set our goals, how we set the motivational climate in which we operate, but also how we perceive that stress. Then when you throw in at the elite level of sport, media perception. So the media will call an Olympic level world-class elite athlete who finishes fourth, they can define that as failure. You might even hear the phrase first loser. They are the fourth best in the world at what they do. Most people I know are the fourth best in the office that they work in. So they're the fourth best in the world at what we do, and we put a public perception and a social facilitation on an interpretation that is a failure. So then when we unpick beneath that, what's the impact on an individual? Well, if you perceive that your personal resources to cope are offset by the environment that you operate in, and you don't believe you've got those personal resources, that creates stress. Stress over a period of time can grow and it can aggregate. And if that stress can create a negative interpretation of you doing sport, you're on a recipe into burnout. And we know that there are a number of athlete cases, go all the way back into the 90s and look at Jennifer Capriati, one of the youngest US Olympic champions, and, went into a spiral of addiction and theft. Look at some of the cases. Bradley Wiggins talks in his autobiography about his perfectionist tendencies, just took him so far, he hated the sport and he hated training. There's a whole host of examples you could pick of athletes that get to this state. So when we're trying to prevent that negative interpretation, we need to get athletes toolkits and coping. So I told you earlier, you had that output, performance and process orientation. If we can get athletes to understand the process by which they enact success and break that down into the technical movement patterns to engage in, we can give them more productive self-talk mechanisms, we can give them more productive coping mechanisms. So what I want you to think about is we're going to just take a moment to adopt a bit of a cognitive behavioural approach to this. So what we think impacts how we feel, impacts how we act. So think of any time you've done any sport, and I don't care if it's in the garden with your kids and you put one over the neighbour's fence and thought, oops. I don't care if you've missed a world championship winning pass. Okay, so think about any time you've played sport. And think about that moment when you think, I've messed up. Don't say it out loud, because I think we're being streamed. Use your inside voice. What's the first thing you say in your own head? Because I'll be surprised if it's not an expletive. Because what you tend to get is that athlete that, let's think about soccer. So that athlete plays the ball, it gets intercepted. The second they think, oops, but a stronger version of oops, there is a momentary drop in their body language. There's a momentary drop in their self-confidence because they're already thinking in the retrospective, because they're thinking about what they just did. The amygdala in the brain, those of you that are kind of into that stuff, the amygdala takes over. So our frontal lobe switches off. The kind of that phrase, rush of blood to the head, amygdala takes over. So when we think, oops, I've just wasted 0.5 of a second thinking, oops, my body's slightly out of position, I'm thinking about what I did. What am I not thinking about? My next movement, my next pass. So if I am in an invasion game sport and a high fast, high decision making team sport at an elite level, and I've just wasted 0.5 of a second, now if I'm Max Verstappen, I'm in the war. Yeah. So if I'm in that scenario where after that error, the first thing I think is, oops. Already, I've set myself up because I'm off the beat for the next thing to have that thing that we would call catastrophe theory in sport, where one thing leads to another, leads to another, and we spiral. So the simplest thing that we ever do with an athlete is to get them in that moment to consider next pass, next move, next. The second we can get them to recover in a setback, and Guardiola actually spoke about this in an interview last week, and I was like, he's been working with good sports, can he? But the second we can get an athlete in the moment of their perceived failure, and even if it's at that micro-technical level, to think forward, we can help them give the toolkit to think about being proactive and to reset it. And that's just a tiny example how we can go all the way from, I want to win an Olympic medal, to an in-the-moment reflection and giving them a toolkit to set them up for success. Because if you Google any failure in sport quote, you'll find thousands of them, because we fail so frequently. But how do we enable us to fail forward, to learn from the process, and actually remove that stress and tension from that position? So how do we become more like our Tony? Oomph, not that great, have a lovely time. Because if we could get a world-class elite athlete to channel that, because they're failing every day in training and in every game they play in, they're going to much more thoroughly enjoy the process. And the definition of performance psychology, perform to the upper range of your capabilities on the most consistent way that you can, and more thoroughly enjoy the process. Because if sport isn't enjoyable, we shouldn't do it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jo, for this. And now to Maher to introduce our fellow today. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, you asked me to keep it short, so I will. I'll just say one thing about failure in sport. We're going to be talking about muscle failure and energetics. Just an anecdote. I think it came from David Bedford, who used to run the London Marathon. A guy turned up saying, I've prepared as well as I can for the marathon. And he said, well, why have you bought a step ladder? And he said, well, I bought this step ladder because I know I'm going to hit the wall, and if I hit the wall, I'm going to climb over it. So it's a silly example, but Professor Niels Ørtenblad from the University of Southern Denmark does not have a step ladder. He has an electron microscope, and he's going to tell us all about how he uses that to determine the energetics of failure in exercise and sport. Niels, thanks a lot.
Good. Thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you for the invitation. And actually, like said before, when we talked during public breaks, I really like the idea discussing a broad subject like failure. And as was said Monday in the introduction, also we do not consider failure as a negative thing. Actually, I'll actually talk about it as a safety mechanism, and I'll come back to that later on. Actually. So these pictures here are pretty much the outline for today. I'll talk a little bit about the history in the beginning. I'm getting that old, so I think history is interesting and important. So, and then afterwards, I'll talk a little bit about metabolism during exercise, and then in the end, I'll talk a bit more mechanistic. Why do we have this failure as we observe actually during exercise? So, first of all, I think most of us within sports science actually pretty impressed by the human performances, and humans are actually very impressive. Also, look in the whole animal kingdom actually. So we can actually perform quite well actually during both prolonged exercise, lasting hours, but also during very short, less than a second exercise. So this is actually the relation between how much energy you can produce, metabolic energy, and how long you can actually endure that before you actually face the fatigue. And maybe you're not familiar with metabolic power or watts or whatever. So this is just to say, well, you can also do it in resting values. So all of you would ever now more or less rest. So that means you're actually consuming about a quarter or a fourth of a liter oxygen. That's actually converted, whatever you use that to convert to energy. And you can actually increase your resting metabolic rate by quite a lot actually. If you are trained, you can increase it by 14, 15 times and sustain that for hours. Really impressive, but you can also go in the other direction and say, well, you can also increase your metabolic rate by more than 40 times and only sustain that for 10 seconds or whatever. And even if you go to like strength training or weightlifting and so on, it's actually a split second you can actually do really, really impressive power. And that's the whole body. You can also go to what's actually the part of the body doing the physical or physical lifting of the body. It's actually the muscles at the muscle level. That's actually part of the task for the muscles. And looking at the muscle level, the muscle cell level, you can actually increase momentaneously. If you're sitting here, your muscle energy turnover is very, very low actually, but you can actually momentaneously increase it by about 100, some would say 200 times actually. But you can also see with this graph, this relation between how much metabolic power you can do and how long you can do it, that there is this disproportional relation between the two. So actually you cannot sustain high power for a long time, and that's actually what we would call fatigue. Actually, you cannot. You have to balance your energy turnover with the time you're going to exercise. So this graph actually raises quite a few questions, which I'm going to hopefully answer some of it actually. So where does the energy come from to do this task, and what is the limiting factor? And that's actually why do we actually fatigue, actually, you would say, both in broad terms, but also more mechanistic. So first of all, you can say, what is fatigue actually? And there are many definitions on fatigue if we talk muscle fatigue. And maybe the most broad one would be, say, it's a reduction of force or power you can do of the working muscle over time. And that's not really precise, because we also want to have it, in order to define it as fatigue, it should also be reversible. So that means otherwise it will be muscle damage, and it's actually fatigue maybe is actually a way to avoid muscle damage, you can say. So it should be reversible, and sometimes depending on what you're doing, sometimes it's reversible within seconds, and sometimes it takes days or whatever, depending on the task you're doing. So that's the definition. So back to the question, say what is actually causing fatigue? And fatigue is actually quite different from doing seconds of work to doing hours of work, or even very, very prolonged exercise, doing days or whatever. So I'm talking a bit more broad on fatigue. So talking about that, I want to introduce you to maybe most of you would be familiar with it, but it's actually how do you actually contract your muscle? How do you do this mechanical energy? That could be like some pitcock here, whatever. So you start a voluntary contraction actually in the motor cortex in the brain. And then through the central nervous system, you actually send this, that's actually just an electric signal, action potential you send through the motor nerve to the actual muscle fiber. You have thousands of these muscle fibers in your muscle. So we actually talk about the central part, that's the nervous part, and peripheral part, that's actually on the muscle fiber level. And arguably, most of fatigue in most instances will actually be on the fiber level. However, if you're doing really prolonged exercise, it will be actually more on the central part. I'm pretty biased, I have to say, but actually, I would still actually we are at the muscle level when we talking about most types of fatigue. So going a bit further into such a muscle fiber, having this this cartoon, you can say, whatever, and I'm going to take you through it, not to be too mechanistic, but I'm going to use this picture quite a few times from now on. So that actually is when you got the muscle membrane here, you have this electric signal coming in here, giving a signal to muscle to contract. And this signal is actually what we call an action potential. So this is just electric current running along the membrane, the sarcolemma, and into these invaginations, which is named the T-tubular system. So in the T-tubular system, it actually comes down, and it actually comes down to a protein which actually senses. It's actually a voltage sensor sensing that now we have an electric signal coming, and it's actually sitting next to some channels, which is the calcium release channels. So we actually have a basic like structure membrane in the muscle. It actually contains the signal calcium. So upon this electrical depolarization, you open this calcium release channels, calcium runs down, concentration increases, and that actually binds to the contractile apparatus, which is actually the main part of the muscle. It's actually doing what we call the cross-switch cycling. So that means that the muscle is getting shorter now, whatever. So the electric signal is actually converted to a calcium signal, and then that's the signal to get it shorter. And in order to relax again, you have to remove this calcium and you use a lot of energy to pump it back actually, and then you can actually release it again. So you have this circle of calcium going in and out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, really governing how much force you should do actually. So that's what we call excitation contraction coupling. And actually the reason I take you through this is actually that you can speculate that when we're talking about fatigue, you can actually do every step in these sequences, which actually could cause fatigue. And they are every step involved depending upon what kind of fatigue we're talking about. Is it high intensity or long term, whatever it is actually. Good. So a number of these steps actually are directly or indirectly dependent of energy. And when we talk energy, we're talking ATP levels in the muscle. And they are actually derived through the muscles, through your intestine, and actually you store it, and we got mainly glucose or carbohydrate or fatty acids actually. And this actually stored, carbohydrate stored mainly in the liver, and also you can say even more mainly in the skeletal muscle. And then you can actually, upon ATP use, you can actually convert it into ATP. So we have this energy storage in the muscle, and glycogen is actually stored as these granules. I'm coming back to that. So this is actually just blue. Every dot here is actually glucose monomer. So we actually store them in small granules, and we can actually see that in some pictures I'll show you later on. So upon use of energy, we actually cut these bindings, and then you have some glucose you can use for ATP. And we know, actually, I'm going to take you through that especially glycogen is actually the important or the limiting factor in many types of exercise. So I hope I can convince you about that. So again, you can say there's actually this balance between how much energy you're using, how much ATP you're using during your contraction, and how much ATP you can provide for this energy use. So this actually this balance, I would say, a very, very tight balance you have between how much you use of ATP, that's when you do the exercise, and how much actually the metabolic machinery can actually deliver of the ATP. And that's actually, this balance is actually very, very tightly kept. So, I mean, in nearly all instances, when we try to measure ATP in a muscle, it's actually pretty constant. So considering, as I told you before, that nearly momentaneous, you can increase your energy turnover by a factor of 100 or something like that. Even during these conditions, we are able to deliver ATP to keep ATP levels constant. So fatigue, maybe I'll start off saying now, that's maybe the take-home message is actually that fatigue is something about being able to keep ATP levels constant in the muscle. So if we're running out of ATP, it actually would be very deleterious for the muscle cells actually running out. So we're not just like a car where you can run out of gasoline and then you can fill it up again or whatever. We need to have some gasoline. The cell would die if you run out of ATP completely. So fatigue apparently is something about avoiding running out of energy, running out of ATP, you can say. Good. So how do you know that? Actually, we know that actually, as I said before, glycogen, muscle, carbohydrate, we know that's really, really important fuel during exercise. And that's been known for more than 100 years, actually. One of the biggest physiologists in our area is August Pope, who actually did this, he could actually measure oxygen uptake just as precise as we can today, and even more, you can say. He has actually measured the exercise performance, and he was actually fiddling around with the diet they got. So when the subjects came in, some of them had only fat. That means they had very low carbohydrate, and they could actually noted actually that it was really, really hard to exercise. They're not able to perform the task we asked them. So that's more than 100 years ago. Then you know that. So that's something about carbohydrate. You need to have your carbohydrate in order to sustain a given task. And at the same time, it was also measured in blood samples at Boston Marathon. That was in 24. They actually introduced this expression of going bump or hitting the wall, as you said, never. So that was actually noted that, well, when you actually go bump or hitting the wall, you don't have a ladder, then you can actually say, well, blood glucose is really, really low at that. So they could actually notice that actually. So it's at the same time. And then a little bit later, 10, 15 years later, there was also a study in Copenhagen by Christensen and Christensen. They actually noted that they could actually, when you exercise for a while, exercise for nearly 3 hours, and then you actually reach the moment of exhaustion, and then they actually gave the subjects 200 grams of carbohydrate, which is quite a lot actually. I wouldn't be able to eat it. It's quite a lot. Then they actually, wow, now we could actually continue exercising 1 hour more. So that's actually, these actually data early 100 years ago could actually say, well, lack of carbohydrate in the diet and hyperglycemia, they are both actually linked to fatigue. And at the same time, you can say, well, we can overcome that actually by actually intake of carbohydrate. So, and they actually took, that was 100 years ago, then more than whatever, in the late 60s, that's more than 50 years ago now. Actually, some of the first studies was done on the muscle biopsies. So we try to look not only into the diet, but also what's going on in the muscle level, which actually was a huge jump within physiology, exercise physiology also. And there was these famous studies by Jonas Bergström, and it's called Bergström, Niels and Ørtenblad. And they did this fantastic study. They actually used themselves as subjects. So, and then it is fantastic design that they're using one bike, a government bike. One was actually biking with the left leg, and the right leg was actually control leg, and the other one was biking on the other side with the right leg. And then fantastic design. And then they somehow agreed on when they were exhausted in the exercising, and 2 biopsies on each other. And some of the first they measured was actually glycogen. And they got this quite a few with this very neat design information. First of all, they could say, well, like this is the control leg, and exhaustion, glycogen levels were very low actually. So there's an association between low glycogen, nearly empty glycogen, as we seldom see, and fatigue or exhaustion. And also they could see, well, it's only the exercising they're using glycogen, the control leg on the other side is not using anything at all. So this is really important information to have. And then you also have some on the recovery, it's not important here. Anyway, so fatigue during prolonged, and I also have to add high intensity exercise, as we can show later on. Intermittent is closely associated again with muscle glycogen. It's not just carbohydrate, we actually know it's glycogen in the muscle. They also did another study, tried to manipulate glycogen in another way. This similar study actually done by team. So they actually had subjects coming in on 3 occasions, exercising until complete exhaustion actually. They came in the first day and on a mixed diet, so they had like, you can say normal glycogen, and then you could exercise for on average 2 hours. Then they sent them home and gave them a diet nearly without carbohydrate. It's really actually really difficult to avoid carbohydrate. And it's not a really neat diet. We actually tried to repeat the study, and the subjects really hated diet. It's like eating cheese and butter and whatever, cauliflower all the time. So the point is actually here that they came home for 3 days without carbohydrates, so they could actually have a sustained low glycogen levels. And when they came in 3 days after, they could only exercise for 1 hour until then they were exhausted. And then they sent them home 3 days again, and now they loaded them with carbohydrates as much as possible, more than they actually liked again. And then came in with really high glycogen levels, and now they could exercise for 3 hours. So that's a pretty good proof. It's actually that we can say endurance during prolonged exercise is associated with starting glycogen levels. Good. So we pretty much know now actually, we know carbohydrates is important. That's not 100 years. For 50 years, we know now that carbohydrate or glycogen is actually the cause of fatigue or the association. And then you say, well, nothing really happens until also very similar study, and that's actually started my interest in the area. So this is actually now we're on a single fiber level. So you can actually take one muscle fiber, and when you have one fiber, you can measure glycogen in it. You can also measure this signal, as I talked about from the beginning, calcium in the cell. So when you send the signal to the muscle, it actually increases calcium level, and that's actually the signal to contract. So they did this similar study, as I said before. So they could actually, this is actually contractions. They can actually stimulate the muscle fiber, and then it starts the force starts to drop until they define fatigue or exhaustion as when force drops to 30% of initial. And then you could say, well, glycogen is low now, 27% of control, and also this signal is actually also decreased. And that's seen in most instances that calcium actually drops when you are at fatigue. Actually, that's the cause of fatigue in many instances. So say, well, that's pretty nice to know, but they also did a really good trick. They also let the muscles recover for 1 hour with carbohydrate in the solution, and then they could actually, glycogen could recover, and then it could completely repeat the study, and actually calcium was actually decreased again. And also they said, well, let's do the same. Let the muscle fatigue, glycogen drops. Now we recover them without carbohydrates. So they are not able to recover that glycogen. And now actually the muscle was sustained, depressed by calcium, force was depressed, sustained, and also calcium levels was also sustained. So this was actually a very cool study, actually showing that, suggesting that, well, the steps in the easy coupling, especially calcium, is actually linked to carbohydrate or glycogen or whatever. And that's pretty much started my career around there. So going back to this cartoon here, you can say, well, what they actually noticed was actually that, well, we have got low glycogen levels, then you actually also somehow associated, you cannot say prove it, but you just say associated low signal in the calcium signal in the muscle. And then they actually just, whatever, moves the question, say, oh, why do you have that? And one of the explanations straightforward would actually be, well, could it actually be step 3? Are we not able to release calcium? So we set up a method and colleagues in the field also to be able to measure directly this, how well do we actually release calcium at fatigue or when we have low glycogen levels. So one study was done in Canada, and briefly they had the same design, saying, well, we have some subjects starting with high glycogen levels up here or normal glycogen levels. And then we let them exercise absorption. Again, they can say, well, they could exercise for 1 hour if they start low levels or normal levels, and if they have high levels, then they could exercise for a bit more than, or nearly 2 hours, you can say. And at the same time, they were able to measure this calcium release rate. And to make a long story short, you can say, well, you actually see when this calcium release rate is actually decreased when you are below a certain level of glycogen in the muscle. So story fits so well, it could be calcium release rate. We also did a study up in Sweden. It was actually Danish researchers in Sweden with the Norwegian world-class cross-country skiers. Very impressive performance, but we actually took biopsies in arms. They used that in legs as well before exercise, and then they actually exercised for 1 hour up here on a race, and actually it was the finish line down here at the snow scooter. 2 biopsies again here in the tent, and then actually also follow the subjects in the recovery period with and without carbohydrates. So we actually have a design where we have different levels of glycogen in the muscle. And at the same time, we also measured the calcium release rate. And we were able at that time to see a clear correlation between how much glycogen you have in the muscle and how well do we actually release calcium signal in the muscle. And you could see actually that, well, when you're below a critical level, as we have defined with a 250 millimolar, then you actually have an increased ability to release calcium. So again, you can say, well, we have some correlation between or link between glycogen low levels and the calcium release rate. So the story so far was actually say, well, low glycogen levels, we are not able to release as much calcium as possible, and then actually, and then actually calcium levels goes down. So this is prolonged exercise. We also done since then quite a few studies also on high intensity. This is actually as doing in sprints. It's again cross-country skiers. Sprint skiing 4 times 4 minutes. They do actually, and that's not a lot actually. We say 4 minutes, 4 times 4 minutes. That's only 16 minutes, or less than actually. It's only 3.5 minutes. And they actually are down below critical level of glycogen. So they are able to reach high intensity exercise. They are able to use nearly all the glycogen actually doing this task. So together with all these studies, measured from the whole body level, different kinds of exercise, triathletes, soccer, down to muscle fiber level, you can actually always see a very close connection between the ability to release calcium or calcium levels and the glycogen in the muscle. Good. So far the story is actually that, but it's not really. Again, I would say, well, this is correlation all. So what's the mechanism? Now we only say, well, there's a kind of association between low glycogen levels and the ability to release calcium so far. So we wanted to be a bit more specific on that actually. And we have a model, I learned the model in Melbourne, we actually can measure, we can use single fibers. And maybe you're not familiar with how big is the fiber actually. So this is just to say, well, we have a whole muscle here, it's composed of those thousands of fibers, 10,000 fibers. We can take out biopsies, or we can take it from a rat or whatever. And this is a very bad picture of a match. You all know how big a match is actually. You can actually add about 40, 50 fibers on the match at the top of, and it's said in another way, that's maybe easier. It's like half of a hair straw or whatever, a muscle fiber. So you're actually composed of all these cells we put together and we call it a muscle. So we're able to isolate these fibers, like such a fiber there. And with this fiber, we can actually say, well, we need to have access to the interstitial. I want to know what's happening in these steps in the EC coupling. And that's like, I mean, always compared to, that's like, I want to know what's going on in a house or whatever. And normally you can only look through the windows and the mailbox or whatever. We actually having this method where you can peel off the membrane, you can take off the roof, the doors and whatever. And now we have access to the intercellular of the muscle fiber. And you can actually still do contractions of the muscle. And the fidelity with this fiber model here is actually that you can actually keep things constant. I would never be able to change pH or low glycogen, whatever, without changing this energy level of ATP. But here we can actually put in a solution, keep ATP constant, and then we can manipulate with glycogen. So we can take this fiber, put it, we can actually measure force on it, and then actually manipulate with solutions. So the way we do it is actually, this is actually one fiber, and this is the pair of forceps. So you actually take a biopsy of muscle and then grab a cup of coffee, so we have steady hands. And then you actually peel off the membrane. You can see this is the intact fiber, and this is part of the membrane. You can actually grab, and then you can actually roll it up. Good. And often also, this like rolling off a nylon stocking or whatever. You know how it is, Stephen, whatever. Good. So now we have this fiber. This we can use for many things. And this is actually, just to make a long story short, this is actually such a skin fiber with high glycogen. We can stimulate it for a long time until it falls up to 50%. And this is a fiber with low glycogen, and we can only stimulate it for a very short time until it falls up. This is actually, you can say, endurance or fatigue. So it fatigues a lot faster with low glycogen, even though, and the point here is actually that we have constant ATP. So ATP is actually kept constant in the muscle fiber, but still actually glycogen has an effect. So that means it's not only about at least lower ATP in the fiber. So that moved the question a little bit. And we can even see where this is a correlation between how much glycogen happens in a specific part of the muscle fiber, and how many contractions you can do until you fatigue. So that's pretty new actually with this actually. So far to sum up, you can say always like when we have a story, we want to see what's going on, what's the link between glycogen and steps in the EC coupling. You can actually measure different steps in the EC coupling. First you have the action, potential, and the electron, then you have calcium release, then you have calcium in the cell, and then you have the force production. That's different levels of measuring things. And then you can also use different preparations. We actually have specific vesicles, that the vesicles containing calcium, sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium vesicles. We have this mechanical skin fiber, we have an intact fiber, we have a bone muscle, and we even have whole body exercise. So saying we haven't proved so far actually between glycogen levels in the muscle and how they affect actually different steps in the EC coupling. I haven't told a lot now, but we actually have quite good proof also that it also affects the sodium potassium pump with low glycogen. But that can actually be measured in the skin fiber, we've done that, and also in the bone muscle. And also you can say the calcium release, we can only measure that directly in these vesicles, as always done together with Stephen also in another study. And then we can say intracellular calcium, we can only measure that in an intact fiber. But force production, we can actually measure in nearly all steps or all different levels of data. So together, I'm pretty confident telling you that, well, there is a clear link between glycogen levels in the muscle and the calcium regulation in the muscle, also causing fatigue, or that's actually the cause of when you go bunk or fatigue. So it's always nice to use different methods and different levels, and you can say, well, we cannot reject the story. You can say, well, you can try to reject the story, but it's not really possible so far. At least it's going in the same direction. So you can say summary one here is actually that muscle glycogen, as I said, is an important fuel during most exercise types and modes, and intensities being key during high intensity exercise. That's the only fuel that's used during high intensity. And it's also, we also know that it's a limited storage. So if you say running at a like marathon pace, you can actually last for 2 or maybe 3 hours or whatever. But if you're doing high intensity intermittent exercises, it only lasts for 15 minutes or whatever. You can also do that, depending on the intensity. And you can also, the last thing I said was actually critically low glycogen is associated with calcium, the signaling in the regulation in the muscle, actually leading to fatigue. Good. So with all these preparations we have here, most of them, we actually take as, I mean, that's what we do in exercise physiology. We are lucky to be able to take muscle biopsies, often from the best muscle. We get a piece of 100 milligrams of muscle tissue out, and we prepare it in all different ways. And then we measure whatever calcium or signaling or whatever we do. But we actually have this analogy saying, well, going back to like in social sciences, mechanistic sciences, whatever, that when first of all, I say you actually need a lot of measuring from here. Actually, this is what I can measure, but I really want to know what's going on in the muscle, right? And it's the same in social science. It's actually I made this analogy saying, well, it's like I want to know something about the society, relationships, psychology, communication, whatever, between humans or other creatures, you can say. And then I actually take the earth and homogenize it, and actually take all these steps here and say, well, how do socioeconomic relations actually relate to our communication or whatever you can say. So we actually lose, the point is actually we lose a lot of information if the more we actually homogenize or change things taking these biopsies. So we actually now try also to go into a method saying, well, we try to use or to have the structure and the keep structure in the muscle fiber. We can do that by taking biopsies, and then actually from these biopsies, without homogenizing the fibers, we can actually keep them intact, and then we can actually do what we call electron microscopy and look at the structures in the muscle fiber. So this is such a muscle fiber here. This is the membrane out here. The fiber is running up here. It's like a tube running here, and this is another membrane. And this is another muscle fiber, and then there's another muscle fiber here. And some of you would know it, but this clear striation here, right? So this is a sarcomere you have here. But you want to go a little bit closer, a little bit deeper into the muscle. And actually, if you go up to the membrane here, this is actually a 5,000 magnification. So that means we have a fiber here. We can actually enlarge it 5,000 times. And now you can actually, this is the membrane up here, not a straight membrane. This is actually a capillary and an erythrocyte here. What's interesting here is that you can also see this, the myofibers and mitochondria. You can see that's the gray scale you got here. And all the black stuff, that's what we're talking about. That's glycogen. So we can actually say, now we can see it actually. It's always nice to see them without measuring. And you also got lipids and so on. And you can also go a little bit deeper in the muscle. So we're also able to do a large magnification, like 40,000 times. So now you can actually nearly see myosin and actin, and this is a C line. And now you can see these black dots here. That's what the granule I mentioned in the beginning, like a granule like this. So this is actually glucose we store like this. And the thing is actually that we store glucose in different locations. Some is just below the membrane, some is actually between these myofibers, and some is actually inside the myofibers. So we are able to, that's very elaborate, we got some good students doing that, count these dots and how big are they actually, and then we can actually get an average of how much glycogen we have in the muscle. So you can say, well, what can you use that for? That's quite nice. But this is actually, if you remember the skiers, we had one example just, this is actually at rest before 1 hour of high intensity exercise. You can see loads of dots of glycogen, especially here in the sarcomere. And this is actually after a bit more than 1 hour of exercise. Hardly any glycogen anywhere. So now we are able to say, well, where do you lose glycogen? Is it from here, or between the myofibers, or below the sarcolemma, or whatever? We can actually estimate that. And then you can say, well, that's cool, but it's really important. I mean, it's very elaborate to do that. But it actually turns out it is important actually. As you maybe remember, we can see a correlation between the skiers at fatigue or glycogen level and the ability to release calcium. It turns out that one specific pool, the one between the myofibrils here, is the one correlating absolutely best with the calcium release rate. Sometimes some of the other pools correlate also, but this is the pool which is important, and this is only one example, but all the studies we've done so far is always intermyofibril, the glycogen in here. So now we move the story a little bit, saying, well, it's actually a specific pool of glycogen. You can't just take an average of glycogen. You just get a number, you take a biopsy and measure it. It actually, unfortunately, you have to do the work and look at this specific pool of glycogen. Yeah. Good. So this pool is actually quite important. So now we can, I mean, in last story, it's not just low glycogen, it's actually low intermyofibril glycogen, which is actually located around here, especially where you have this, if you look in 3 dimensions, it actually would be located around here where you have T2 and calcium release rate. So anatomically, the story also makes somehow sense. Good. So the summary, just to sum up, you can also say now, most of glycogen is located in distinct pools, and actually the one of the pools, what we call intermyofibril glycogen, is actually apparently the one being associated with fatigue. So, and I'm not really happy with that, it's quite cool, but it just means that we have to spend a lot of time measuring this glycogen in an EM in order to elaborate on the story. Good. So the last thing I'm going to say now is also that, I mean, if you think back now, actually, all the data we got now has actually been obtained by correlations, saying, so we manipulate the glycogen, and that did that already 60 years ago, whatever. You can manipulate with the diet or exercise or whatever, having high, low glycogen levels, and then we can actually correlate it with something, calcium release rate or force or whatever. But as you also know, as you actually learn, nearly first-year students, you say this is not doesn't say anything on causative effects. I mean, you can just see a relation between two things, and it doesn't really say you have a causative effect of things. So we've been wondering how we can, whatever, come around this. And recently, that's not that, whatever, 5-6 years ago, we actually started to use some inhibitors. So this is actually, we have glycogen in the muscle. We need this enzyme named glycogen phosphorylase in order to use this glycogen here. So we actually now have found some inhibitors of glycogen phosphorylase. That means we can actually have a muscle contract, use glycogen, and then we can actually immediately block. So it actually goes bump immediately, let's say, or hit the wall without the muscle. We can actually use these inhibitors, or we can also, by treating them with amylase, we can also just remove the glycogen. So we can do that in the skin fiber I showed you before, and then say, well, it can actually be its own control. Now we don't have correlations, we actually have the same fiber, saying immediately we can change the situation in the muscle. And this is just some unpublished data so far. This is actually a muscle where we can actually contract it down. You can see force goes down until it goes down to 50%. And then actually we can say, we can repeat this control muscle after it's been recovering for a while. But we can also take the same muscle and add these inhibitors and say, well, now we just suddenly inhibit. It's not able to use glycogen, the same fiber. And then we actually got the situation where often we see, bang, now it actually fatigues quite a lot fast. So that's a bit more convincing. I actually sleep a bit better now. That then say, well, we have this inhibitor and we can even have 2 different inhibitors and so on. So it's hard not to believe that it actually affects the muscle. So using this one, we can actually also prove that, well, glycogen is actually using it as its own control. That's a huge step in my eyes. And this is just average. I mean, when using these different inhibitors, force actually drops immediately. Good. So this is actually what I'm doing currently. Actually, I'm on a sabbatical in Stockholm. I'm actually able now on a simple fiber here, measure what you need calcium in the cell. So this is actually just some signal. We can bang, stimulate the muscle, then calcium increases and drops again when you stop the signal. So that's actually what we have here. So now we use these inhibitors also, and you can also say, well, you can stimulate the muscle with at different frequencies. That's actually the way we control the force in the muscle. And you can also see, well, calcium actually increases as you would expect in this muscle. And then we can use these inhibitors saying, well, now actually cut off the ability to use glycogen in the muscle. And then actually calcium levels drops fairly substantially actually with these version of the inhibitors, which actually again say that's another way to prove that say glycogen is important for the calcium level in the muscle cells so far. Good. So we actually trying all the time actually to challenge this idea with using different methods and so on. And I would be happy to have some more methods using to try to challenge the story. But so far, I think we're pretty convinced that glycogen levels actually are in controlling calcium levels and thereby force also. So the story at the end is actually say, well, low glycogen actually inhibits calcium release rate, which actually in turn decreases calcium level in the cell, and actually in turn actually decreases the signal the muscles to contract, and that's what we call fatigue or at the level of exhaustion. So that's pretty much the story so far. The last thing I want to say, the very last slide, is actually on saying, well, that's pretty neat to do, be able to do that, but you also have to take 1 or 3 steps back to say, what is the physiological significance? What does it actually make sense, as I said from the beginning? Why would muscles behave like that, cell behave like that? Saying that the energy somehow controls the way you contract. I mean, why do you fatigue? That's not really, in a way, stupid to fatigue, you can say. But you cannot continue it. You cannot go out in your car or whatever and just continue until you're running out of gasoline, as I said before. We actually have a stop mechanism here to avoid that. And that's probably, as we say, we have this really, really tight balance in the cell. We keep able to keep ATP constant, at least globally in the cell, actually. So that means that exactly the ATP or ATP utilization is actually met with the ATP reduction. And how do we do that? I mean, going to biochemistry, if you're taking biochemistry courses and so on, and metabolic courses, you can say, well, there are quite few ways to say, well, ATP or low ATP levels could actually stimulate the production of ATP, low ATP, calcium, whatever, PI and whatever, loads of things you can do biochemically. But that wouldn't really be a sensitive signal to have. Then say, well, I want to avoid ATP running out. So it cannot be the utilization controlling the production actually. Then you would actually run down ATP. So here we actually propose you can say this is a feedback signal. We propose a feed-forward signal saying, well, if I'm not able to produce ATP, we have to turn down the ATP utilization so we can keep it in balance, right? So we have somehow to say, well, how do we signal that we're not able to produce enough ATP to use it? And in a way you can say it, and again, if you go bunk, you can say, I'm running out of glycogen. I'm not able to, I don't have any more energy. I cannot keep on having a high exercise running intensity. Then the muscle would run out of ATP and that'd be deleterious, whatever. So then you end up dying. So well, here we actually have a feed-forward signal saying, well, glycogen affects energy turnover by modulating its calcium release. That's a crucial signal in the muscle. So that means, I haven't talked about the electric signal, but actually we can actually decrease the calcium release. So that also means got low calcium in the muscle, then you can actually, then you also decrease the ATP utilization, right? And that's actually what we call fatigue or failure, whatever you want to call it. So failure is actually a positive thing here. You can say, well, I want to, not if you are an elite sport performance or whatever, but you actually can, delay this fatigue actually in different ways, right? So that's the idea, at least physiological significance. I've got no idea if it's correct, but it makes sense to me actually. So we can always discuss that. So with that, and a long talk, I will just say thank you for the collaborators and actually both in Odense, especially Joachim, who's actually doing all these fantastic electron microscopy pictures, and then also collaborators in Sweden and abroad. So thank you for your attention so far. Sorry.